He didn't know who I was, and that made his words sting even more. I was standing just a few steps away when my brother-in-law laughed with his friends at a family gathering and said, "Women like her? They're pretty faces with empty heads. The kind you smile at, but never take seriously." His tone was smug, dripping with the kind of arrogance only someone cushioned by privilege thinks they can afford. I froze, my heart thudding, but I stayed silent, almost invisible, because I knew something he didn't. The woman he was mocking so casually was me. Not just his sister-in-law, not just the quiet girl he'd seen at dinners, but someone with an entire life outside of the family circle. A life he had never cared to ask about, and certainly a world he had no idea overlapped with his own. In that moment, I let him dig his own grave with every word, storing his insults like notes in the back of my mind, because a part of me already sensed what was coming. I had no idea how soon fate would twist the knife or how poetic the timing would be, until the day he walked into my lecture hall, and his smirk faltered. The irony is that he had always carried himself as if he were the smartest man in any room, puffing up his chest with half-baked opinions and recycled jokes, and everyone else, especially women, were props in his little show of superiority. At family gatherings, he would dominate the conversations, correcting people on facts he barely understood, raising his voice so no one dared to challenge him. I learned quickly that silence was my greatest weapon, because in silence I could watch him expose himself over and over again. He saw me as timid, polite, the type to smile politely and fade into the background. But what he never realized was that while he spoke about real men building empires, I was quietly building my own career, brick by brick, paper by paper, lecture by lecture, until my name was etched onto academic programs that mattered. He had no idea I had a PhD. He had no idea students lined up after class to ask for my mentorship, that my research was being cited internationally, that I was invited to conferences he couldn't even dream of attending. To him, I was just the wife of his brother, a tag, an accessory, nothing more. And that ignorance was almost sweet, because it meant he revealed the true depth of his disrespect without even realizing he was insulting someone in his own family. What made it worse was the way my husband, his brother, shrugged whenever I mentioned it. "That's just how he is," he'd say, as if a man's arrogance was a permanent fixture like bad weather, something you endure but never question. I bit my tongue because part of me knew the world had a way of teaching lessons sharper than any argument I could craft. I just didn't expect the lesson to come in the form of a semester's first lecture, with 200 pairs of eyes fixed on me as I walked to the podium, adjusting my blazer, stacking my notes, looking every bit the professional he thought I could never be. When the door opened and he walked in, backpack slung over one shoulder, face relaxed with the assumption he was entering yet another space where he would sit, dominate, and smirk, I almost laughed. Because in that moment, the tables weren't just turned, they had been rebuilt entirely. He froze mid-step when he saw me at the front of the room, his expression slipping for the first time since I'd known him. The confident swagger he carried like a second skin faltered, replaced with a flicker of uncertainty as his eyes darted to the syllabus projected on the screen where my name, my full academic title, was printed in bold. The silence between us lasted less than a second, but in that heartbeat I watched his carefully constructed ego crack. He tried to recover, forcing a smirk, sliding into a seat near the back as though this was just another lecture, just another professor he could tune out. But I saw the truth in the stiffness of his shoulders and the way he gripped his pen too, tightly. He knew exactly who I was now. And suddenly the woman he had dismissed as irrelevant had the authority to command his attention for the next 16 weeks. I didn't call him out. I didn't need to. Instead, I began teaching with the same calm precision I had perfected over years, layering complex theories with real-world applications, weaving in discussions that challenged students to think beyond Their assumptions. And every time my brother-in-law opened his mouth, every time he tried to interrupt or assert dominance with a half-formed thought, I countered not with anger, but with evidence, questions, and calm dismantling of his points, until his voice shrank into silence. The class quickly recognized who held the power in that room. It wasn't him. What amused me most was watching him try to navigate this new reality. Outside of family dinners, he was just another student, one of many, stripped of the privilege that insulated him at home. Here, his last name meant nothing. His charm meant nothing. His arrogance was met not with indulgent laughter, but with academic standards he couldn't bluff his way through. And as the semester wore on, I could see the tension in him growing. He couldn't fail without facing questions from his family. He couldn't succeed without acknowledging that the woman he had mocked was the one teaching him. It was delicious in a way, this quiet, steady unraveling of his ego. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I simply taught, graded, and moved forward with the authority I had earned. But every test, every assignment handed back with red ink was a mirror he couldn't look away from, a reminder that his words had been cheap, but my reality was undeniable. By the third week, the dynamic in the lecture hall was cemented. Students who had first been skeptical of my authority now leaned forward in their seats, scribbling notes furiously as I broke down concepts they once thought impossible. Questions flooded in after class, and I could see their trust in me growing with every session. But my brother-in-law? He sat stiff, sometimes hiding behind a laptop screen, other times forcing his way into discussions with clumsy attempts to dominate the conversation, only to be corrected with patient but firm guidance. I never singled him out. I didn't need The room itself seemed to turn against him, peers growing tired of his interruptions, eyes rolling when he spoke. The respect he once assumed was automatic was now something he had to earn, and he couldn't. He had walked into that hall imagining he'd be the clever one, impressing classmates, perhaps even undermining me for sport. But with every passing day, it became clearer. He was out of his depth. I watched him struggle with the reading lists, scramble on assignments, and stumble when presenting ideas. His arrogance had been a shield at family dinners, but here it was an anchor, dragging him down in full view of people who didn't know or care who his family was. What made it more satisfying was the contrast. At family gatherings, he still tried to play the role of the untouchable know-it-all, but I had seen him stumble. I had seen the panic in his eyes when grades were handed back. I had heard the uncertainty in his voice when he tried to challenge me in class and failed. And the more he tried to cling to his image at home, the more invisible cracks began to form in his facade. My husband noticed it too, though he didn't put the pieces together right away. He just said things like, "He's been quieter lately," or "He doesn't argue as much anymore." I bit back a smile because I knew the reason why. Power is a funny thing. At home, he thought he held it over me. In that lecture hall, stripped of his assumptions, he had no power at all. And he knew it. Midway through the semester, the pressure began to show in ways even he couldn't mask. He started missing classes, handing in assignments late, excuses spilling from his mouth like broken glass, flat tires, family emergencies, computer crashes. I'd heard them all before, and my policy was the same for everyone: documentation or no extensions. Watching him realize that my rules were not bendable, not even for him, was like watching a storm tighten around someone who thought they were invincible. He tried to test boundaries, lingering after class as though to remind me of our family ties, dropping hints that I should understand his situation better than anyone. But I never gave him that opening. I treated him exactly as I would any other student, no more, no less. And the look in his eyes told me he hated that equality more than he would ever admit. Equality to him was humiliation. The other students, oblivious to the family connection, began to notice his decline too. His once loud voice grew hesitant, his half-smirks replaced with tight jaws and darting glances toward me, as if gauging how much more of himself I had the power to expose. And the truth was, I didn't have to expose him at all. He was doing that just fine on his own. At home, the shift was even starker. He was quieter at family dinners, no longer quick with his usual barbs and condescending jokes. When I spoke, he looked down or busied himself with his drink, careful not to challenge me directly. My husband sensed the change but chalked it up to stress. Only I knew that the stress had a name, a face, and a lecture hall. I didn't gloat, didn't reveal the truth to anyone. Not yet. Because the beauty of this kind of revenge wasn't in the reveal, but in the slow, steady collapse of a man who thought he could walk through life unchecked. Every grade he earned from me was fair, every red mark deserved, every silence in that classroom earned by his own arrogance. And I knew, by the end of the semester, when final grades were posted, there would be no more illusions left for him to hide behind. When the midterm results came back, the weight of reality finally landed on him. His score was low enough to drag down his entire average, and there was no hiding it because I returned exams in front of the whole class. Students came up one by one, collected their papers, some smiling with relief, others sighing in disappointment. When his name was called, he shuffled forward, eyes darting around the room, trying to mask the tension in his shoulders. I handed him the exam without a word. A big, unmistakable CI in red ink stared back at him. He froze, lips tightening, and for a brief second our eyes met. That same man who had once laughed loudly about women being nothing more than pretty faces couldn't even hold my gaze. He sat back down, kept his head lowered, and for the rest of that lecture, he didn't open his mouth once. The change in him was almost imperceptible at first, less confident when he entered the hall, quieter when peers debated, slower to speak up when I posed questions. But I noticed. I noticed every single flicker of doubt, every moment when the mask of arrogance slipped and the real man underneath, the insecure, frightened one, peeked through. I didn't punish him. I didn't humiliate him. That wasn't necessary. My silence was sharper than any retaliation could ever be. And the more silent I was, the more space he had to stew in his own realization. Weeks later, when group projects began, I deliberately paired him with two of the brightest students in the class, knowing full well he would either step up or get exposed. He tried, fumbling his way through, but every time he failed to contribute, his group mates carried the weight and subtly froze him out. For the first time, he wasn't the loudest voice in the room. He was the weakest link. At home, I watched the frustration seep into his posture, the way he snapped quicker, drank more, and left dinners earlier. My husband, confused, asked if I'd said something to upset him, and I only smiled, shaking my head. The truth was, I didn't need to say a word. Life, justice, whatever you want to call it was unfolding in that lecture hall, and I had a front row seat to every step of his undoing. By the time finals were approaching, he was unraveling completely. He stopped trying to impress anyone in class. His hand no longer shot up with half-baked answers. His interruptions dwindled to silence. He began sitting in the farthest row, shoulders slumped, avoiding eye contact as though invisibility could shield him from the consequences of his own arrogance. But invisibility was impossible when the numbers spoke louder than any excuses. Missed assignments, poor test scores, a group project where his name was listed last, almost as an afterthought. I could feel his resentment simmering each time. I walked into the lecture hall, though he never dared speak it aloud. He knew better now. What struck me most was the shift at home. Around the dinner table, the man who once filled every silence with smug commentary now avoided conversation altogether. When others laughed and shared stories, he pushed food around his plate, eyes lowered, his sharp edges dulled. It was as If he feared that at any moment I might casually mention his performance in front of everyone and peel away what little pride he had left. I never did. That was the sweetest part. I let him live in that limbo, where only he and I knew the truth, that his carefully crafted superiority was crumbling under the weight of my authority. My husband noticed, of course. "He's not himself lately," he murmured one night after dinner, and I only replied with a soft smile. People change when life humbles them. The irony was almost too rich. The man who had once laughed at me for being just a pretty face was now being taught, line by line, grade by grade, what real substance looked like. And it wasn't loud. It wasn't boastful. It was measured, earned, undeniable. Every lecture I gave, every paper I graded, wasn't just education. It was a mirror I held up to him, forcing him to face the reality he had always tried to hide from. And by the time the semester neared its end, I could already see it written all over him. He would never look at me the same way again. The day of the final exam arrived, and the atmosphere in the lecture hall was tense but focused. Students filed in quietly, armed with pens, highlighters, and a nervous determination. I stood at the front, distributing papers row by row, my heels clicking softly against the floor. When I reached him, he didn't even look up, just extended a hand, trembling slightly, and muttered a quiet, "Thanks." It was the first time he had ever addressed me with something resembling humility, and it caught me off guard, though I kept my expression neutral. For 3 hours, the room was silent save for the scratching of pens and the occasional shuffle of papers. I moved between rows, observing, answering clarifying questions, making sure no one strayed. From my vantage point, I could see him sweat through his shirt, his eyes darting between the exam booklet and the clock, lips pressed tight as if every second was another reminder of how unprepared he was. When the time was up, I collected the exams one by one. His was near the bottom of the stack, edges crumpled, handwriting frantic and uneven. There was no confidence in those pages, only desperation. Later, grading them alone in my office, I flipped through his answers carefully. They were riddled with errors, surface-level observations that might have impressed a casual dinner guest, but crumbled instantly under academic scrutiny. I didn't grade harshly. I graded fairly. And fairness alone was enough to seal his fate. The final mark dragged his overall average down to the point of failure. Staring at the gradebook, I knew he wouldn't just be facing academic consequences. This would echo at home, in the very space where he had built his arrogant persona. He had underestimated me, underestimated the weight of my silence, and now, the weight of reality had caught up to him. I didn't smile. I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was something colder, steadier. The satisfaction of knowing that justice had unfolded naturally, without me ever having to raise my voice. When grades were finally posted, the ripple effect was immediate. My inbox filled with polite, anxious messages from students, some celebrating, some seeking feedback, some asking how they could improve in the future. Buried among them was his name, the email subject line reading only, "Grade concern." I opened it, and the words inside were desperate, stripped of the arrogance I'd come to associate with him. He begged for reconsideration, claimed he had been under unusual stress, hinted at family obligations, even attempted to appeal to me as his sister-in-law. It was almost laughable. Here was the man who once dismissed me in front of friends, now scrambling for leniency, invoking a connection he had always disrespected until it suited him. I drafted a calm professional reply, the same I would send to any student. Grades reflected performance, not excuses, and appeals required official documentation. Nothing more, nothing less. I didn't sign it with anything personal. I didn't acknowledge our family tie. I remained professor, not relative. Days later, I overheard whispers at a family gathering. His mother mentioned he was struggling with a difficult professor, painting him as a victim, sighing as though the world was unfair. I sipped my wine, listening, invisible in my silence, knowing full well that difficult professor was me. My husband caught my eye across the room, raising a brow, curious at my small secret smile. I didn't explain. Not yet. Because the truth wasn't just that his pride was broken. It was that he had finally learned what it meant to face consequences beyond charm and bravado. Watching him shrink at that table, avoiding my gaze, fiddling with his glass while his mother made excuses for him, I realized I didn't need to say a single word. The humiliation wasn't in being called out. It was in knowing I held the truth of his failure, and that he could never spin the story to make himself look untouchable again. Weeks passed after the semester ended, and life slipped back into its usual rhythms, or at least it did for everyone else. For him, the fallout was unavoidable. He had failed my class, and with it, jeopardized his academic standing. I heard, through hushed family chatter, that he would need to retake the course, that he'd been summoned for academic probation meetings, that he was scrambling to explain away his poor performance. His usual excuses, bad professors, unfair grading, unprepared classmates, didn't hold up anymore because too many people knew the truth. Other students had thrived under the same conditions, excelled even, and word about his arrogance in class had already spread. He couldn't frame himself as the victim without looking even weaker. At home, the change in him was stark. He no longer strutted into family dinners. He arrived late, shoulders hunched, eyes tired. When conversations turned toward careers, education, or ambition, he shrank into silence, stabbing at his food while others filled the air. He avoided me altogether, never meeting my eyes, careful not to spark any direct confrontation. My husband finally noticed enough to ask me outright one evening, "Is there something between you two? He seems different around you." I only said, "He's learning," and left it at that. The beauty was that I never had to expose him. The humiliation was self-inflicted, playing out in real time with no dramatic reveal needed. His failure was written in his transcripts, his silence, his slumped posture, and every time he glanced my way and quickly looked down, I knew he remembered every word he had once said about women being nothing more than ornaments. He had mocked me without knowing who I was. Now, he could never forget it. The next family gathering was almost surreal. He walked in late, carrying none of his usual bravado, offering half-hearted greetings before sinking into a chair at the far end of the table. The man who once dominated conversations with smug jokes now barely spoke at all, his voice low, his words careful. When his father asked how school was going, he muttered something about rough semesters and changed the subject quickly, eyes flicking nervously toward me as though I might betray his secret at any moment. I didn't. I smiled politely, passed the dishes when asked, engaged in casual chatter with everyone else as though nothing unusual lingered between us. That was the cruelest revenge of all, the quiet reminder that I didn't need to expose him, because he lived every day, with the fear that I might. Later, as dessert was served, he slipped out to the balcony, and I found myself watching him through the glass doors. He leaned on the railing, shoulders hunched, staring out into the night like someone who had been cut down to size for the first time in his life. My husband noticed too. "He's really not himself these days," he said softly, almost puzzled. I just replied, "Sometimes people have to lose themselves a little to find out who they really are." And I meant it, because I didn't hate him, not really. What I hated was the arrogance, the dismissal, the condescension he had built into his identity. Now, stripped of it, he was just a man confronting the reality he had always avoided. I left him to his silence, knowing he would never again look at me with the same careless disdain. The lecture hall had done what family dinners never could. It taught him humility, and it taught me the sweetest lesson of all, that revenge doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes, it's enough to stand tall, say nothing, and let the truth speak for itself. The true aftermath revealed itself slowly, in small moments that told me the lesson had sunk deeper than any humiliation I could have orchestrated. At the UI next semester's start, he enrolled in different courses. None in my department, of course. But the shift in his demeanor was undeniable. Friends of his family mentioned he was quieter now, less quick to argue, less eager to prove himself. I would catch glimpses of him at gatherings, listening more than speaking, nodding along rather than interrupting. It was strange to see him diminished, but also strangely fitting. He had lived so long in the echo chamber of his own ego that being forced into silence was the only way he could finally hear the truth about himself. At family dinners, he avoided eye contact with me completely, as though even looking at me might trigger the memory of those long afternoons under my authority, sitting among peers who saw him struggle, fail, and stumble. And though I never revealed a word of it, the power of knowing, of carrying that quiet secret, was intoxicating. He knew I could dismantle him with a single sentence, yet I never did. That restraint was sharper than any confrontation. My husband once asked why I never told anyone the full story, why I didn't claim credit for teaching his brother the lesson he so clearly needed. I answered simply, because he already knows. That's enough. And it was. He had mocked me without knowing my name, insulted me without realizing who stood before him. But when he walked into my lecture hall, the roles changed forever. Now, whenever our paths cross, I see the subtle flinch in his posture, the way his voice drops, a little lower, the way his laughter dies a little quicker when I am near. He can never erase the memory of standing at the back of that hall, realizing too late that the woman he dismissed so carelessly was the one holding the pen that determined his future. And for me, that knowledge will always be enough. Months later, the family dynamic had shifted in ways subtle but unmistakable. He no longer strutted into rooms expecting attention. Instead, he lingered at the edges, speaking only when directly addressed. The others chalked it up to growing up or maturing, but I knew better. I had seen the exact moment the arrogance drained from him, the day he opened his exam and realized failure was no longer something he could laugh off. The truth lived in his eyes every time he glanced my way and quickly looked down, as though one meeting of our gaze might unravel him all over again. What made it even more satisfying was the ripple effect. The people who once indulged his arrogance began to notice his silence. His friends didn't crowd around him the way they used to. Family members didn't wait for his opinion on every matter. Without the armor of arrogance, he was simply another voice at the table, no louder, no sharper than anyone else's. And while others pitied him, thinking he had lost confidence, I saw it differently. He was finally tasting the humility he had denied for so long. I never lorded my victory over him. I never told the story to embarrass him in front of anyone. That was the beauty of it. My revenge wasn't loud or public. It was private, woven into every moment he remembered that classroom. Every time he recalled the sound of my heels clicking toward his desk, every red mark on his exams. He carried the memory like a weight no one else could see, and it bent his back in ways that changed him permanently. In my silence, I had become the lesson he could never escape. The final proof of his transformation came almost a year later, when our families gathered for a holiday dinner. The table was loud with laughter, cousins chattering, parents reminiscing, glasses clinking. But he remained subdued, pushing food around his plate, nodding politely at conversations, but never seizing them the way he used to. At one point, his father boomed proudly about how both sons are doing so well, and the words hung in the air like a test. He shifted uncomfortably, eyes flickering toward me before lowering to his plate. He didn't correct the narrative, didn't puff up to reclaim the spotlight. He just let the silence pass, a man who had once needed validation now too aware of the truth to grasp at it. Later that evening, as people drifted into the living room for coffee and dessert, I stepped onto the balcony for some air. Moments later, I heard the sliding door open behind me. It was him. For a heartbeat, I wondered if he might lash out, try to reclaim some dignity by confronting me privately. Instead, he leaned against the railing, not meeting my eyes, and said quietly, "You're good at what you do." That was all. No apology, no explanation. Just 6 simple words, stripped of arrogance, heavy with a humility I had never thought I'd hear from him. I didn't reply right away. I let the silence stretch, let him sit with the weight of what he had just admitted. Finally, I said softly, "I know," and walked back inside. That was the end of it. He never insulted me again, never mocked me, never tried to diminish me. The man who once laughed at my supposed irrelevance now carried the permanent memory of being reduced, not by my anger, but by my quiet power. And in that knowledge, I found a peace sharper and more lasting than any dramatic confrontation could ever offer. Years passed, and the memory of that semester never left him. I could see it in the way he carried himself whenever we were in the same room. More careful, more measured, always with a trace of that old shame lingering beneath his forced smiles. He built new habits, tried to reinvent himself, but the ghost of that lecture hall followed him everywhere. And though no one else knew, I did. It was etched into the way his voice softened around me, the way his shoulders tightened when I entered a room, the way he avoided any topic remotely connected to education or authority. What he once used as weapons, arrogance, charm, condescension, had been stripped from him, leaving behind a man who finally understood that not everyone could be talked down, not everyone could be mocked into silence. The irony was that he thought he'd insulted a stranger at a family gathering, when in truth, he had insulted the very person who would one day hold his academic fate in her hands. That twist of fate, so poetic, so exact, was something I never stopped marveling at. And in the end, I never needed to tell the story to anyone else. It remained mine alone, a quiet victory that shaped the balance of power in ways no one could see but both of us could feel. He learned humility, I gained vindication, and together we carried a secret that shifted the foundation of our family, forever. Because revenge isn't always loud or explosive. Sometimes it's a quiet reckoning, unfolding in lecture halls, whispered in red ink, remembered in silence. And that silence, his silence, was the sweetest revenge of all. Over time, the story faded from everyone else's memory, but between us, it never truly disappeared. Every shared meal, every holiday, every casual encounter was laced with the invisible thread of that one semester, binding him to a truth he could never rewrite. He aged, matured, even found new roles to play in the family, but that flicker in his eyes whenever he looked at me never changed. It was recognition of who I was, of what I had done, of the lesson he could never erase. And I carried it with me too, not as bitterness, but as proof. Proof that dignity doesn't come from shouting down insults or demanding respect. It comes from knowing who you are, from standing tall in the face of dismissal, from letting the truth speak louder than arrogance ever could. He had insulted me once, smug and careless, believing his words would vanish into the air. But fate, in its twisted way, delivered him straight into my world, where every careless word turned into fuel for his undoing. And in that undoing, I found not just revenge, but peace. Because the real victory wasn't in watching him fail. It was in knowing that he would carry the memory forever, that in his mind, no matter how much he tried to rebuild, there would always be a lecture hall, a failed exam, and my voice at the front of the room reminding him that he had underestimated the wrong woman. That was the scar he would live with, and the quiet crown I would always wear. Sometimes I wonder if he ever tells the story in his own way, framing himself as unlucky, or as the victim of a professor who had it out for him. Maybe he does, Maybe he doesn't. It doesn't matter. Because no matter what words he uses to soften the memory for others, he can't soften it for himself. He knows the truth. He knows that when he walked into that lecture hall, expecting to own the room with his usual swagger, he instead walked straight into the lesson of his life. And that knowledge is something he'll never outrun. I've seen the subtle ways it's changed him over the years. He no longer interrupts women mid-sentence, no longer scoffs when someone challenges his opinions, no longer fills every silence with the sound of his own voice. People call it growth. They say he's matured. But I know it's more than that. It's the shadow of humiliation that reshaped him, that forced him to look at himself differently, that taught him respect in a way nothing else could. And the most poetic part is that it all happened without me lifting a finger in anger. I didn't scream, didn't retaliate, didn't expose him in front of the family. I simply stood where I had always stood, in the fullness of my own power, and let him crumble against it. My revenge wasn't in ruining his reputation or shouting my triumph. It was in the quiet permanence of knowing that every time he looks at me, he remembers the one place where he had no control, no excuses, no way out. The one place where he finally learned who I really was. And though no one else at that dinner table, no one else in our family, will ever fully know what passed between us in that hall, he and I will carry it forever. A silent bond, forged not in love but in consequence, not in kinship, but in the justice of fate. And so here we are, years later, the dust long settled, yet the memory still sharp as glass. He never insulted me again, never dared to roll his eyes or laugh off my words the way he once did. In fact, he rarely speaks around me at all, as though every syllable he might utter could drag him back to that lecture hall where his arrogance was dismantled piece by piece. Sometimes, when our eyes meet across the table, there is no hostility in his gaze, only recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of what passed between us. He knows who I am now, not just as his brother's wife, but as a woman with her own authority, her own legacy, her own strength that he cannot diminish. And perhaps in his own way, he is grateful for the lesson, though he would never admit it aloud. Because arrogance had blinded him, but humiliation opened his eyes, and the man he became after was softer, more measured, less cruel. I do not forgive the insult. I don't need to. Forgiveness would imply that he still had power over me, and he doesn't. What I carry instead is something far stronger. The knowledge that I never lowered myself to his level, never let his scorn define me, never sought revenge in anger. My revenge was in my existence, in my success, in the undeniable reality that when fate offered me the chance to stand before him with authority, I didn't need to gloat. I simply did what I had always done. I taught, I led, I stood tall. That was enough to undo him. That will always be enough. And perhaps that is the true lesson, not just for him, but for me. That dignity isn't in proving someone wrong with shouted words, but in letting life itself expose the truth. That power isn't in crushing someone loudly, but in standing so firmly in who you are that their arrogance collapses under its own weight. He insulted me once, without knowing who I was. But when he walked into my lecture hall, the world turned, and he learned exactly what it meant to underestimate me. That memory is mine to keep, mine to savor, mine to carry quietly in the spaces where silence speaks louder than words. And in that silence, in that unshakable truth, I found not just revenge, but victory.